late, he didn't put his mic on. So welcome everybody, Happy New Year, despite the fact we're nearly payday this week. Apologies, we have one, Councillor Pearson and Councillor Runciman has taken their place. So welcome. Declarations of interest.
Thanks, Chair. I just feel like I ought to mention, as Early Talk for York is on the agenda, that I delivered Early Talk for York for a year.
Right. I'm not sure if it counts, but I get free childcare under the item later on. So I'm much in favour of that, and I'll just speak honestly very highly that we increase it massively. If I speak at all, so thank you very much. Minutes to the last two meetings. We'll go the supplementary one first, is that right, Reece?
Yeah.
So we've got the ones from November. Anybody, anything from November's minutes? All happy? Propose and second them, please. Oh, do we do that? No, just approve them. Yeah. Different sort of meanings. And December's. Anything from December's? We'll all be done with 7:15. Public participation. We have nobody tonight, so we can wish through that one. And on to SACRE. Maxine and Martin, welcome.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to present to members of Scrutiny the annual SACRE report for the academic year 2022-23. There is a requirement that elected members have seen the annual SACRE report before it's actually sent to the Department for Education and is shared with the NASACRE as the National Association for SACREs. SACRE is an interesting advisory committee. It is a statutory requirement that local authorities are advised by a standing advisory council on religious education. It's a key part of the Education Act, and as a part of that, there is a requirement that each SACRE in the country prepares an annual report so that it's able to summarise its business and its meetings, and also give a view on the health of religious education within the local area. As you'll see, during 2022-23, there were some challenges around the quoracy of SACRE meetings. I think one of the things that impacted on it was the fact that we'd come out of a period of remote meeting and then gone back into all meetings being in person. It did have an impact on some of those meetings being quorate, and it did lead SACRE members to discuss the importance of having the option of members being able to join future meetings remotely, but still encourage people wherever possible to attend meetings face to face. And what we gradually began to see as the year developed was that attendance at meetings began to improve, and that's continued into the current academic year. We did as well during 22-23 see a change in the chairing of SACRE following the council elections. So at the beginning of that academic year, Councillor Waller was chair of SACRE, and then handed over to Councillor Webb for the meeting in June. In terms of the things that we need to report on, a key part of the SACRE report is the way in which the members of SACRE monitor standards and the quality of RE in the city. And we began in 22-23 a process of monitoring visits with schools. We had a willing guinea pig to try out the school monitoring framework, and that was Ralph Butterfield Primary School. They felt the visit to be very beneficial. They received a written report following that visit, and it confirmed that the process that we were using around future monitoring visits felt to be the right one. And there will be a programme of further visits this academic year, and we will visit not just a primary school but also a secondary school as part of the visits this academic year. In terms of religious education in York, there's still strong take-up for religious education in York in comparison to other areas of the country. It's still seen as an important part of the school curriculum in York. There's really strong use of the agreed syllabus, both amongst maintained schools and many academies use our city agreed syllabus, even though they don't have to. And so RE is in good shape in terms of the number of exam entries and also the results achieved through those exam entries, both at Key Stage 4 and at Key Stage 5. So it remains a popular and a high-performing subject for those children who take it. One of the things that just to draw your attention to is the comparison between the outcomes at Key Stage 5 and Key Stage 4. So that in 22-23, the boys outperformed the girls at Key Stage 5, which is actually quite unusual and sort of bucks some of the national trends around this. Although we've got to bear in mind that the majority of those pupils were white British and also came from a high performing background. So you could sort of say they were a bit of a self-selecting group. At GCSE, as you can see, girls outperform boys both in attainment and progress, and the highest achieving groups were of Indian Asian heritage at GCSE, and made up a significant cohort with 28 pupils, and also really good performance with from young people with English as an additional language in RE as well. And again, that sort of books the national trend in those areas. So what that's indicating is that there is some good teaching and learning going on, both at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. And we still do have a high percentage of teachers who are RE as a first subject in our secondary schools. So, they are actually teachers who have a qualification in RE rather than it being taught by a teacher as an additional subject. And again, that shows that the health of RE in those schools. We are in the process of analysing the results from the annual survey to schools, which was sent out in October. And that will be used to identify some of the priorities, the school-led priorities around further training and advice during the current academic year. We have also as well, through the newer members that have joined SACRE this year, we're beginning to think about some new developments, for example, really using young people's voice to inform the work of SACRE. And that work started last night with a young people's voice event prior to last night's SACRE meeting. And I understand that went very, very well. And I've been looking at those areas of the country which actually do have a youth SACRE. And I'll be taking some proposals around how we can actually develop that in York. We do have a very long-standing relationship with York Interfaith. And so SACRE members, some of those as twin hatters in that they're also members of the interfaith group. That's been really useful in terms of the fact that they are promoting more and more work with schools. So the interfaith group have got a programme of school visits, which they're able to promote. They will make themselves available for things like school assemblies. And that's been quite a rich offer as well. And they did in November 2022, they ran a logo competition for schools. And that ran across both primary and secondary schools. and resulted in some really good engagement from Archbishop Holgate School and from Ralph Butterfield School, who both put in a significant number of entries for that. I think York Interfaith is planning to look at another competition, which they think will be a writing competition in the next academic year, 24-25. We continue as well to support York Holocaust Memorial Day and the events surrounding that. And during the academic year 22-23, we had a specialist RE advisor who came from the Diocese of York. She has now ended her work with SACRE, and we've not recommissioned any specialist RE support, but I continue to act as the LA advisor to SACRE. So I think that gives you a roundup of what was happening during that academic year, and I'd welcome any questions Scrutiny may have.
Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for that, Maxine. And I just want to note the comments that Councillor Webb had at the beginning of the report, in the annex, because I think it is really important just to highlight how important a good understanding of individual different faiths is at the moment, and also really good, I thought, to see the humanist element in there as well. The question I had was just around monitoring, and in particular, I just wanted to understand what we do and what we can do around monitoring. If I understand this correctly, there are some external organisations that come into schools to deliver some elements of the syllabus, and again, my understanding is that quite a number of schools in the city are using one organisation in particular. And when SACRE is monitoring the delivery of the syllabus, are they looking at what that individual organisation is doing as part of that, or are they looking from purely the school's perspective, and how does that relationship work?
Yeah, what they look at when SACRE members go in to monitor RE in the school, they've got a programme that they follow. So there is a pro forma that we follow. And it is to look at what external organisations are the school engaged with, what visits do they do, how have they decided on the choice of those external organisations, and obviously if there are any concerns, then SACRE has in the past received complaints which they've actually looked at as part of the SACRE process about any organisations where it's felt that there may be reasons to worry about any aspects of what they do, and certainly SACRE have done that through complaints being raised in the past.
Thank you. I'm just wondering almost about, before we ever get to a point of complaint, you know, just if there's that ongoing sense, because as I say, I think it's really, really important that we all have this awareness, the differentiation between an awareness and then anything that kind of crosses beyond. And likewise, you know, just understanding the content of some of the delivery and whether it's purely factual. There's quite a difference between sort of saying, you know, somebody of this particular faith believes these sorts of things versus this is a factually correct thing that is related to my particular faith, if you see what I mean. And I appreciate it's probably quite difficult ground for SACRE members, but I'm not quite sure what as I say, it's just understanding how that monitoring can work before we ever get anywhere near somebody making a complaint.
Yeah, and obviously SACRE members aren't always there when somebody's presenting something, and obviously they've got to also make sure that they're not overtly representing their own faith as SACRE members as well, because it is about the quality of the RE experience. Bob, I know you want to.
Yeah, I just wanted to go in. So we had a meeting of SACRE last night. Councillor Wilson, Councillor Knight, you were both there, and we did discuss exactly this quite extensively about, because we'd had a pre-meet with young people, and it was something that was raised to us by young people about visits, and things that we sort of explored were, you know, how independent were some of those visits, and also is there an issue around the fact that some faith groups are very, very well funded in comparison and very large in comparison to other faith groups, and actually when the purpose of religious studies is to know more about lots of different organisations. So we sort of discussed last night, it was very early days, but we're hoping over the next few months and few meetings that we can start to draw together maybe some guidance for visits to share with organisations. And on top of that, obviously trying to improve the number of different organisations that know about schools and schools know about themselves, so that there's a bit more, there's a wider pool to choose from. So these are things that have been raised with us directly by young people and that we're beginning to action as of now. So that was part of it. And just the other one thing about that came up last night was about school visits. We sort of had a bit of a discussion about it and thought that actually doing, because we've got the primary school that's been done, and that sort of worked well as a primer, we sort of thought maybe doing a probably C of E, because it's probably the largest number of faith schools in the city. So a C of E primary school and a secular primary school, and do a bit of a study of the two before we then thought about secondary afterwards.
Yeah. And obviously one of the things about the agreed syllabus is that those schools with a church designation don't have to follow the agreed syllabus, because obviously they've got a diocesan syllabus which takes parity over that. But I think that's a useful thing to do. Many schools in practice, as I say, do adopt the agreed syllabus because it's a good syllabus and they find it works very, very well. The other thing, just to reassure you as well, to keep that balance in terms of thinking about belief, is that our humanist member has actually asked that when we review the agreed syllabus, that we review it in the light of non-faith and keeping the balance in that. And it was an active discussion we had when we looked at the last iteration of the York census, which did actually show that, you know, sort of there were a significant number of people in the city who were of no faith. And so we felt we needed to feed that into the future reviews of the agreed syllabus.
Councillor Runciman, then Councillor Knight.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered if Maxine or Bob know if SACRE produces any guidance for monitoring, because I think your idea of having sort of standardised approach is a good one, and it could easily be said to be influenced by people of different faiths. So if they could give you some advice or tell you somewhere that's doing it that they think is doing it well, that might be very helpful.
We did develop the current monitoring framework using some advice from SACRE and also advice from our specialist RE advisor who was with us last year, Olivia Seymour, because obviously she's actually the local representative of SACRE.
Yes, thank you. Just to qualify slightly on what Councillor Webb said from last night, I don't think we expect groups coming in to talk to school to be independent, because they're not going to be. That's not what they're about. I think the emphasis is more on making sure that other groups have access to the schools and that the young people have access to hearing from the different groups. I think that's the point, rather than an independence, because that's the nature of the beast, isn't it? It's been pedantic there.
Sorry, Councillor. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I think a really important aspect of the work of SACRE is to involve local RE teachers in the work of SACRE, because that, in a sense, would encourage them to look more broadly at the kind of organisations that they invite, and they go to visit as well. What I can say from my limited experience of chairing SACRE is that schools that I've talked to were interested in going out. As has been indicated, there is one particular group that's got a predominance of, I suppose, resources in which to make visits. And they do a short programme of visits when they go to schools, which is probably much more ambitious than other groups have. But having said that, to the non-established faiths, if I can use that word. Certainly the 3 schools in my ward are interested in looking at other faiths and in going to temple or whatever to see what the practices are and to understand what the nature of the worship is and why it's carried out as much as how. So I think that there is a base to build on, Councillor Webb.
You will note in my report, I did thank previous chairs. No, I think that you're right, that actually, following on from what you said about the SACRE, yes, we talked last night about how we can involve them, and with RE teachers as well. So we spoke with school children yesterday from both primary and secondary, which I think we had about 8 young people, I think, something like that. So, and they were from different faith groups, which were often quite underrepresented in York. So that was quite nice. I was talking with the vice chair after the meeting about maybe we might want to repeat that in a different part of the city, see if we get other people. But another option or something we might want to do longer term is think about doing something similar, but with RE teachers, just to get their view on it as well. So, yeah.
But one thing we did talk about was a conference for RE teachers, so there's a hint. Thank you for that, and thank you for the current chair of.
Councillor Nelson.
Thank you, Chair. This is perhaps a little bit off the edge of the report, but something that I was wondering about was, in my experience of working with mainly primary schools across West Yorkshire, I'm aware that there is often occasional, like it's not unusual for occasional pushback with certain aspects of religious education being taught, or certain types of school visits, you know, across the board, from children or from parents, and that's one of the really difficult kind of balances that schools have to find. Obviously, there's the statutory RE curriculum, statutory PSHE and sex ed curriculum, but I know there's a balance, and I know that sometimes there can be pushback from parents in the delivery of that. I was wondering whether SACRE has a role or sees itself as potentially having a role in sort of establishing how much of an issue that is in our schools in York, where those issues arise, and supporting schools in how they navigate those issues.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that SACRE keeps an eye on is where we get applications with what's called determination to withdraw children from religious education. And over the years in York, it's very, very rare that we get that. So there seems to be good tolerance of RE, people not asking to withdraw their children from RE in the city.
Can I just follow that up by asking, if we think of withdrawing your children from all RE as perhaps the furthest end of that scale, there may still be kind of perhaps little places where there's a rub, or there's a bit of tension, but it hasn't reached that point of withdrawing children. Do you see that potentially SACRE could have a role in surveying schools or speaking to our schools about whether those issues are rumbling on under the surface but not reaching that level?
Certainly, it's one of the things that we can pick up in the annual survey of schools. If there are any concerns around that, because we're always looking at developing that annual survey, and we've changed the question slightly for this year's survey. So it's certainly something that we could incorporate, see if there are any concerns or tensions out there at the moment.
Thank you.
Anyone? Councillor.
Thank you. Just on that note, as a bit of feedback, really, I think one thing that isn't always obvious to parents, I know because I know and I kind of keep an eye out on things, but there's certainly been occasions where external organisations have come in and you find out a few days later that they've come in. I had a situation with my own children in a primary setting a few years ago where we chose to withdraw from a particular visit from a particular organisation, as did a number of other parents, but it was very much about the nature of that individual organisation rather than anything to do with religious education. certainly into secondary school, that same organisation I'm aware of has been in and taught my daughter's class, and I've only found out after the event. So I do think that there's also perhaps something around, you know, how schools communicate with the way in which their syllabus will be delivered and by whom and to what end. Because as I said at the start, you know, I'm really, you know, personally devoutly atheist, but absolutely fascinated by all sorts of different beliefs, whether they're religious or otherwise. And I think it's really important that we all understand each other. But that's different to exposing your child to something which may or may not have a different motivation behind it, which you then might choose to not take part in.
I suppose it's managing the tension between the fact that obviously in law we are a broadly Christian country, and we have an established church, and there is a requirement for schools to have an act of collective worship as part of the Education Act, and that's very often where they're bringing different groups in to fulfil that duty as well. One of the things we are going to look at as SACRE this year is we last looked at the guidance for schools around collective worship in 2017. So I am going to suggest to the chair that we actually relook at that guidance and bring it up to date. But it is one of the things about the role of religious education within the English education system. You know, it is defined by law. It's one of the few bits of the school curriculum that actually has to be delivered. And we aren't a secular country in the way that some countries are. We have an established church.
I think just to finish on that one, you imagine this is SACRE meetings all over. This is just in and out what happens there. Last night we talked about this, and it's that subtle difference between information and proselytizing. And of course, there are some religious organizations where it is almost baked into their religion that actually they are spreading a message and sharing a message, and that is part of what they do. But I actually think in terms of what we were saying about guidance to schools and to visits, I think there's something in there about how do we speak to parents about things beforehand, potentially. Yeah, because I think that there's, you know, it can come from all sorts, but we shouldn't ever be sort of pushing something on young people. We should be there to educate and inform, I think. But yeah, we are aware of it and looking at it.
I think it is helping children to understand that that is the nature of certain groups, and helping them to use their discretion to begin to filter out. You know, it's a bit like fake news, isn't it? How can we develop the children's understanding of how to assess what they're hearing as well, and to discriminate?
Sorry if I may, and I appreciate we're kind of labouring a point slightly, but I do absolutely, I do absolutely agree, and I think in a secondary setting, absolutely, and I think in a way that's where the kind of being informed beforehand. So I'll use an example from my daughter. So an organisation came into the school a few days after this had happened. My daughter was asking me about the evidence for the existence of Julius Caesar versus the evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ, because they had been told by this organisation that there was equivalence, that there was just as much evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ as Julius Caesar. Now, for me, talking to my, at the time, 13-year-old daughter, that opened up a really great conversation and discussion, and I was able to explore all sorts of different things about all kinds of stuff, and that's how I would hope it would be for lots of other people. Had she not have asked me that question, I wouldn't have known that the organisation had been in there, and she may not have necessarily questioned her own thinking until some point quite a long way further down the line. And I suppose that's where I'm just a little bit anxious in terms of making sure the monitoring of what goes on, because I think you're right, if it's an overt proselytizing, A, we all understand that, and B, it can be a discussion point, but it's almost that slightly subtle imparting of not quite factually accurate things from somebody who is presented as an external expert. that's where I think it just becomes a little bit risky.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to add that one of the points that came up in the SACRE meeting last night was that sometimes there's a little bit of a disconnect between pastoral invitations in to speak to the whole school and the RE department. So the secondary RE teachers who were there were explaining that sometimes it's not completely, it's not down to the RE department. And so I think there's probably some work for us to do around those sorts of groups and the RE department working together.
And it's this difference, as I say, between that collective worship duty and what happens in religious education.
All happy? Lovely. We can move on to attainment. Derek and Maxine again.
Okay, yeah, I'm Derek Sutherland, Head of Primary School Effectiveness and Achievement. But the word school isn't just school, it's quite broad than that. It's early years. So we have within my department early years quality improvement as well as school improvement, and also the governance team that support governors in schools. The report is about the gap between disadvantaged young people and children and their peers. So it's focused very much on that. So you're not getting outcomes for all children. It's very much focused in that area. Obviously, our ambition is that all children do well and they get their lifelong learning and they achieve. But historically, it's been really difficult with disadvantaged children and young people. And that's been really tricky. And as we were beginning to narrow the gap before the pandemic, it is, in most cases, as you can see, has widened again. Not that I want to blame everything on the pandemic, but actually it's had quite an impact. You know, in disadvantage for early years foundation stage, less than half the children who are disadvantaged achieved GLD, a good level of development. And that has fallen slightly from the previous year. What we do have there is something called Early Talk for York. So we're sort of like, you know, it doesn't feel like it's had the impact in that area that we want. But the Early Talk for York started in a small set of schools, and that is branching out and branching out. And at the moment, we are upscaling that. But there's three parts to Early Talk for York. There's very much identification, there's training up the workforce, and there's becoming friendly in ELCON training as a school. So you've got your whole school is very much rich in that. So when we look at the schools that have had that full offer, they're actually, in 2018, their data was only 50% of children, disadvantaged children, were achieving. Children who have had the benefit of Early Talk for York in the full way, they have achieved that 78% of those disadvantaged achieve. Now that's one small cohort in 1 year in 2023, but it does show is some hope that this approach that we're using is effective, and we just have to look at how we put the resource in to upscale it. We will be upscaling, and I'll come back to that, how we're going to do that. In year one phonics, that the government want every child to be able to read, decode there. And there's a phonics check at year one. And that is one of the areas of green shoots that actually has improved in a certain way, in that the number of disadvantaged children achieving phonics has gone up from 57% to 64%. So that is good. However, it still means only 2/3 of our children are achieving, disadvantaged are achieving. So there's still work to do. But what we are seeing is schools have taken on a synthetic phonics scheme, that it's very well sequenced, that it matches the books, and that the workforce is being trained. So we've got two things that are working where we've really, there's a clear approach, there's clear assessment and going on, and there's clear staff development, and they're the real strengths of why they're working, but that takes resource, quite a lot of resource. If we look at Key Stage 1, that's your sort of 6-7 year olds, It's mixed. Some areas the gap's widening and some is narrowing. And it's a little bit of a mixed picture there. But when we look at Key Stage 2, there's very little improvement in Key Stage 2 in terms of narrowing the gap for disadvantaged pupils. And that's and yet before we were doing quite successful in narrowing the gap in that area. GLD in that area was the worst, and actually Key Stage 1 was our trickiest. So you could say that Key Stage 1 was slightly lower point anyway, whereas Key Stage 2 was at a higher point there. So we're really struggling at narrowing that gap. And also our disadvantage in York, children and young people are not doing as well as disadvantaged nationally. So that's another area. So whilst we got most of our young people doing better than national average, our disadvantaged junior doing less than national average. So the gap looks very much accentuated. So that is really wide. And that's where that gap, that wide gap really happens. In Key Stage 4, again, in most areas, they're not doing as well as peers, and the gap is widening between the peers. I've got one correction, so thank you, Councillor Webb, for spotting it out. Paragraph 23, I had put that the gap in the last sentence there, the gap between disadvantaged cohort and their peers has widened from 13.1 to 14.5. Actually, that was not the case. However, it was the wrong data. Sorry, it was 22. Yeah, 22. Actually, I said it widened from 0.55 to 0.85. I don't know where that figure comes from because it's not anywhere else in the report. The correction is it's minus 0.33 and widened to minus 0.64. That's progress. So if we think as progress, average progress is not. And people who do better get a score above naught, and people don't do as well, as much progress get a score below. So actually the fact that we're 0.33 below and now gone to 0.64 below, that's widened in that sense. And that's happened in a lot of areas, that gap is widening. The only area that is slightly higher than national average is the e-baccalaureate. The APS score is slightly, but it's marginally, it's not like a long way. So here we have doing again, Key Stage 4 outcomes are good when you compare them nationally, but for disadvantage, they're not. Okay, so that is an issue. And that's been a real conundrum right the way through the education. It may be that our disadvantage aren't the same as disadvantage nationally. In fact, when we look at our disadvantage, they usually come with multiple barriers and not just deprivation. They're usually coming with things like SEN. So a lot of ours have SEN, special educational needs. A lot of them have additional challenges at home and in learning environments. There's certainly a challenge around attendance, that our free school meals children do not attend anywhere near as well as their peers. So I give you an example that a non-disadvantaged child on average has less than 6% of time off school, but a disadvantaged child or young person has 38%. That's a huge difference of attendance. So attendance has to be, if we're not getting into the school, it doesn't matter about the quality of teaching learning. And this has been a real conundrum because when we were narrowing the gap before the pandemic, a lot of work was done on the quality of teaching learning and also about that metacognition approaches, metacognition approaches and things like that. And actually they're not seeming to work. And actually when you see that disadvantaged attendance has absence has increased, you can see, well, they're not in school, they're not going to benefit from that approach. We do know that for some of our young people, they don't see the school as a place to learn, to be. So we have to change that narrative. So it's not about the quality of teaching learning. I go and do deep dives and Ofsted, go in and actually we get a very good account for York schools in the quality of provision, quality of teaching and learning. What we're finding is a lot of disadvantage have forgotten how to learn through that pandemic are anxious about school and their peer groups, and they know they're falling behind, so that puts added anxiousness on. So we really have to think about their social, emotional well-being rather than teaching and learning. So that is an area that we've been a bit late in coming to, but we're doing a lot of exploring about that. So whilst we got really good things in like early talk for York that's making a difference, we're expanding that to more talk for York. So 2 secondary schools, that's Joseph Browntrees and Hunting Research School, have screened every child who didn't achieve reading, writing, maths in year 6 at the end of Key Stage 2. And they found that, you know, a high percentage of those young people were red flagged, as such, were red. Quite a significant proportion, about half of them. Not half. 28% didn't achieve, had difficulty, and they have clearly identified speech and language needs, because it was a speech and language talk. Of amber, so very shaky and not solid on them, 21.5%. And those that passed that with no, you know, red or amber flags was 50%. So 50% of the children and young people that didn't get the end of Key Stage 2, year 6, have identified speech and language problems of varying degrees. And that comes quite a shock, because you'd think, why wasn't that picked up earlier as they've gone through all primary education? So what we have is we have a really good identification toolkit in early years now, and we have now got moved to secondary, but we haven't got it in primary ongoing. And as you probably know, York used to be a very stable community, but now there's quite a lot of change, particularly in year. And so we need to address that as well. So we're bringing the early talk for York into Key Stage 2 before they leave secondary, and then in secondary, obviously doing that. And then we have baby talk for York, which catches the very young children, and that's really working with families and professionals and in childcare and things. So that really good, but that is speech and language. And what we have to do is more about go further and thinking about not just making sure that they've got the ability to communicate, talk properly, but do they feel good about themselves? And do they feel they belong to York? Do they feel they belong to their school community? And in quite big numbers, there's ones that don't. So that's something we need to tackle and do more work in. So we're looking at schools. So we're looking at schools that are really in that difficult area that are feeding into Joe Rowe, Rowntree and into Huntington, and working with those schools about what we do with that sort of Key Stage 2 age group. There's a lot of things going on. My other task is to make sure we're good in York at doing lots of different things, but it's making sure they're well coordinated together and helping each other. And that's going to be the focus. So I'm going to put a strategy map together that allows all those. So any school can look in and dip in, say that I'm more involved in this, but we can expand into these areas. So, because at the moment, I think there's lots going on, but we don't know what everyone else is doing. So that's another area that we want to look at. And the other one is we have increasing vulnerability of anxious and that of children and young people who have some, well, I would have called hidden disabilities, but that neurodiversity, and which links into social emotional and for young children, personal social development. And that's an area that we're going to upskill the profession in, because one of the things that we know is where we've got good CPD going in, good training going in, and awareness, we have better results than just putting in something targeted at one school. So we've got something for early years sector, childcare sector, and schools coming together for a launch of the ADHD Foundation on neurodiversity. The other thing we need to look at is trauma, because I think there's a lot from the pandemic has suffered trauma. I didn't write in there, but I was thinking about through the lens of social emotional lens. Okay, so I just open to questions.
Yeah, I think just a couple of points. very early in the report is just really important. I think that we acknowledge that the disadvantage is significantly lower than the national rate. And therefore, you've just got to rebalance that sort of sense of actually, if you're just working on percentages, it's inevitable that every child gets a higher percentage than if you've got a higher percentage disadvantage, if that makes sense. I think the other important issue is to consider not, don't just consider this as an educational issue, it's fundamentally a health issue as well. You know, the specialist provision for speech and language is scarce. I think York should be really proud of the work that it's done in early talk for York. So they've had some phenomenal success, and hopefully that will grow. But I think we've also got to acknowledge the fact that you know, if you are 2 and you've had an identified speech language communication issue, you may well still be waiting to be seen at the age of 5 when you're starting school, and that's far too late. So actually, school readiness when you actually get to school is a significant issue, and something that we've got to consider in terms of some of our partnership work with health.
Just picking up on Martin's point, the speech and language in the early talk for York is practitioners, school teachers have access to a speech and language therapist. And what they've seen is that they had some to be, you know, on the waiting list to be seen, but because it's been done through the school and schools have developed that sort of expertise and can ask, that they don't diagnose anyone in school, but the profession can ask them questions. They've seen a reduction in people withdrawing their referrals. So actually, the more we can skill up and use expertise, but allow access for schools to go on that expertise, actually we can reduce the pressures on the national health system.
Councillor Russell, and then Councillor Nelson, Councillor Wells.
Thank you. Derek, I just wanted to ask something and then make a comment. In any of those cohorts, are they small in size so that 1 or 2 children doing, yeah, I thought so, really well might push the average up, and 1 or 2 children doing really badly or not there at all will pull the numbers down? Is that the case?
Yeah.
And then I'll make a comment.
Sorry, you could go to a school, which I do, and say, how are your disadvantaged doing? And 100% didn't get. So none. How many children? 1, 2. Yes. And this is the real problem, is that we can't group them together, and nor should they be, because they should be in their local schools and communities. But this is the real difficulty, is the small numbers we have. But when you collect them across, as this is in our authority, it looks a large number, but in individual schools, it's quite small. It's quite challenging for schools in that way. The other thing is Ofsted. We've had really good Ofsteds who have said, you know, Westfield's last one said, the school is doing absolutely everything it can do within its powers, resources, and what you'd expect of education. And they go beyond and more. And we're hearing that quite often, yet outcomes are quite low for disadvantage. This is the conundrum we have.
One comment, Chair. I think what you said is extremely interesting, and I can see the problem of the cohort size, which is often covered up with percentages. But I'd really like to find out what happens about your actions, particularly the attendance project, because that's a particularly difficult one. And I think it's a legacy of COVID, particularly with children who had great difficulty getting to school for whatever reason, and may or may not have had sufficient equipment at home, let's say, to do home learning. So I hope, Chair, that it can come back with an update, particularly on 27 to 31. And thank you, Derek. It was very interesting.
I will do that. And I did think I would love the opportunity to come back, sadly, but to come and see the progress of those and whether it's making a difference for our young children, because I think it's important that we keep reviewing and reflecting to make sure we are going in the right direction, because sometimes you can set off thinking this will work and it doesn't. So we need to continually do that.
Thank you. I've got a couple of comments and a couple of questions, if I may. Stop me if you think I've had enough time. Thank you very much for your report, and thank you for the really comprehensive talk through you've just given us, actually. That adds a lot to what's written down. I've got a couple of comments. I'm just going to push back on a couple of things slightly, but please don't take it personally. I think that it's really important to acknowledge that our pupil premium children in York are not any different from other pupil premium children in the rest of the country. When you're talking about multiple and complex needs and a lot more going on at home, particularly this stands out to me today because I've come to this meeting straight from my governor monitoring visit as pupil premium governor in the school that I'm a governor at, where most of the conversations we were having are, you know, so are we using pupil premium funding for this? Well, it's really difficult actually because our pupil premium children are also SEN children. They're also going through processes for EHCPs. They're also they're also being referred into family charities because of issues at home. They're also children who, you know, potentially have experiences of DV or these other things. They're coming to the school's attention in numerous different ways. They're also often children with English as an additional language in the school that I work at. That, you know, they meet multiple categories. And if anything, I would say that our pupil premium pupils in York probably are less complex than some of, or, you know, the average pupil premium child, perhaps in some of the schools in inner city Leeds, for example. But the fact that you said that made me sort of reflect perhaps on the fact that we are a very small local authority who are used to having really good schools. And we're used to having as a city above national average high attainment and things like that. And we know that we've got much smaller cohorts of those pupil premium children. So actually, when we talk about the figures and when we talk about, well, maybe that means we can discount some of the percentage issues and things like that, perhaps approaching things from that direction is part of the problem. And I wonder whether there has been any work or might be any work about talking to other local authorities and schools within local authorities about the issues, because I've seen some incredible, really, you know, working strategies in many. I work with lots of schools in Leeds, so I appreciate that. That's where I'm coming from on this. But I've seen fantastic strategies. Yeah. And if we're only looking at ourselves and if we're concentrating on York and what's going on in York, I wonder whether that's part of creating the vacuum. But, you know, it may be that loads of that is happening. So I think that's my main comment. And just when we're talking about the children that fall into this category, I think it's really important we don't sound like we're blaming those children for, you know, actually we're not meeting their needs, but it's because they're really difficult. It's because there's lots of things going on, or it's because they meet all these other categories. It's because, for whatever reason, we are, as a local authority in schools, failing those particular children in a very specific context, in incredibly difficult circumstances, lack of funding, lack of staffing. I'm not in any way blaming our individual schools, but I think that it's important that we kind of think of it from that perspective, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, and I totally agree with what you're saying. It's really complex. If there is been a growth, you know, a number of children free school meals, say, that's more or less doubled since 2018. So it is a different place in some ways. Pandemic did have an impact, so it's a different, you know, it's different. I agree that they're probably no more complex and not complex than anywhere else. But I suppose what we have is some unique challenges in York that maybe aren't in a big local authority, probably how best to put it. As far as working with others, we did actually take our teachers up to Redcar, Cleveland, to look at school and how they were doing it. And it's that strategy that came back that worked really well. We did a writing project, which worked really well. But what we're finding is the issue isn't about the quality of teaching and learning. That's where it's shifted. And that's where we do need to look at what's happening nationally in that space, as well as what we need to do in our unique set of circumstances.
And my question, if I'm allowed my question, was slightly more nuts and bolts, really. This cohort of disadvantaged pupils, is this pupil premium pupils specifically, or you know, who is included in this cohort? Because it does, I think at one point it said, my laptop's obviously just gone off now, it said something about a cohort of, you know, we're talking about 200, 300 children across the city. I'm fairly sure there are more than 300 children in my ward who, depending on how you are classing disadvantaged. So who are these children and how are we trying to capture that data and the progress and follow the other children who perhaps are we might class as at risk of disadvantage or not quite meeting pupil premium standards, which is basically impossible to meet, but equally kind of in need of following if possible.
Yeah, it's predominantly pupil premium grant to children, and they're made up of preschool meal children, looked after children, that sort of disadvantages that they have. It's not your IDACI in terms of the IDACI disadvantage, okay? But it's not SCN either unless they got those multiple barriers.
So actually, I almost wonder whether in future it might be useful to have a couple of different cohorts in the data. I'm just aware that pupil premium is such a small and specific kind of way of looking at things, but I understand why you've used it and it makes total sense.
When we tend to talk about the gap, it tends to be that cohort. However, I have no problem because I will do a send one. I'll do, you know, so I'm quite happy to make it a report that includes different disadvantages rather than the prescribed one by the DFE as such, because it's very much the one that's, you know, DFE, and it comes off a computer system which tells me, but I'm quite happy to put, say, send in or, you know, some other areas in. It's absolutely
Thank
fine.
you so much.
No, Chair, but thank you very much. I always made it a point that if somebody had already made the point, I wouldn't. And unfortunately, both Councillor Runciman and Councillor Nelson have done that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the report. I just would like to echo some of the points that Councillor Runciman made around the cohort sizes. And I think one of the things that jumped out to me just in terms of trying to understand the data was it would be really helpful, I think, to have some reference points to the citywide. I know there's some national stats, but actually to the, I hate to use the term non-disadvantaged, but you know, the overall cohort versus just this particular cohort, just so we get a understanding. I know you've got the gaps in there, but you know, sometimes those overall figures. And likewise, I think although it's really difficult because of the absolute sort of, well, I don't know what the right word to use is, but you know, the last few years has been a not representative few years, and I think we all understand that. But at the same time, looking at data from a small cohort just year on year isn't always helpful, and sometimes just getting that sense of, if it varies by 10% every year, then we know that a 10% up or down isn't necessarily good or bad. Whereas if it's a consistent every year, it's gone up or down, and then we've got a better sense of direction. So that is a sort of an observation, if I may.
I have them anyway. I'm really happy to put an annex with the trends as well, and put more detail in. It's just when I got the things, it said keep it concise.
Yeah. And it is beautifully concise.
I ripped out pages, kept it to the gap because I'd pre-done this report, but when it came to, so I had lots of details about norm, you know, all pupils and that. I'm happy, but if I keep it to the written bit more about the gap and send, you know, to put that in, but I'll give you things that give you the comparisons and trends and graphs as an annex to that. Would that be? Yeah.
And then the other sort of thing I just wanted to pick up. So one was just a specific thing about language, and then just a general point. So page 29, paragraph 31. There's some really positive things, I think, with the ADHD Foundation. There is the wording that says that people who live with ADHD and autism, and that implies it as an impairment. I think a lot of the literature around autism and ADHD would see it as a difference. So if children are autistic, they don't live with autism. And I just think it's a sort of subtle thing, but I think it does really matter to those children and families. I think that there's some really interesting things in there, and you said the word trauma, which I thought was a really important thing. I think it applies in general terms, in terms of the sort of experience that a lot of children have had. I think particularly around ADHD and autism, there's a growing body of evidence that the reason why children reach burnout or struggle with attendance is because they find schools traumatizing, and they have that level of trauma that actually asking them to continue to go back into an environment that has traumatized them is not going to help. And I think I know that some of the things that we've been looking at around EHCPs kind of touch on this as well, but it seems to me that there's a real opportunity to not just support and help, whether it's children that are autistic or ADHD or are pupil premium or otherwise, looking at the whole culture and the whole culture of the system in a way that is as inclusive as possible and addresses some of those issues around trauma, but actually also speaks to some of that stuff around attendance as well. Because again, I think we all understand the importance of school attendance, but having just gone through the looking around all of the secondary schools for the transition from year 6 to year 7, it was striking that every school I went into, plastered all over all of the walls, were all the terrible things that would happen if you didn't have 100% attendance. And I know that, you know, we're all finding our different ways of trying to encourage children and young people to see the benefits of being in school. And for the vast majority of them, it is a benefit, you know, absolutely. But we do also need to be mindful of, if you have missed for no reason of fault of your own, if you happen to have missed half a term or even a week or two, and then you're confronted with this is going to cost you, you know, half a GCSE, or it's going to affect your life, you know, that in itself is quite a traumatizing message. And I think we can do better as a city. And I think we have a really strong role that we as a local authority can do in trying to lead on that and push that and guide that, because I think we all want to get to the same place. It's the sort of the how we get there.
Yeah, I think this is something that the country is struggling with, to be quite honest, and we can see both politically and professionally, nationally, there's lots and lots of debate about what the right way and the wrong ways, and I don't think we've landed on any of those issues yet. I think it's hugely complex. I think the reality is we have a legal responsibility, a legal duty to ensure that children are in school, and we've got to do everything in our powers, including at times using some fairly draconian powers, to make sure that parents who aren't getting their children, that could get their children to school, do, alongside others who may well have children that have got neurodiversity and perhaps need a different approach. The reality is, when we're giving that wide communication, it's for the vast majority of the population in many ways. So I think there's some challenges that we're still learning nationally, and I'm not sure that we will always agree nationally whether we got that right. You know, it's always going to affect one child or one family in a different way than a whole of others. So it's continuous work, I think, and we're trying to work on a fairly regular basis about the nuance of those messages. I agree, I think, in terms of the messages in school per child, but it's also then what do the school do in other aspects of the work that they're doing with children in terms of giving the positive messages. They're not just giving that negative message of, if you're not here, you're going to fail your GCSEs. You know, there's lots of other messages that are going on a daily basis. So, but I completely take your point that I think we need to think about it in a very different way than we perhaps have done 10 years ago.
If I may, I mean, I think hopefully we're thinking about it in a better way than we were even a year ago, let alone 10 years ago. I think for me, the fundamental issue is, you know, if you've got children who are struggling with anxiety and pressure, then the last thing they need is any more anxiety and any more pressure. And if we are taking that sort of inclusive approach, and we've all, you know, again, if you think about social model of disability and all of those sorts of things, it does actually matter, even if it's only 10 children that are seeing that message on the wall and it's traumatizing them, it does actually matter. And we do need to think about an approach that could benefit every child, because I think that does exist. And it is just, you know, the advantage of being a small local authority is that actually we can affect change across the whole of our area in a way that perhaps you couldn't if you were thinking about, you know, Greater London or you know, otherwise. I also...
Sorry, can I just respond to that?
Yes, of course, yeah.
I think, you know, I said earlier about there's lots of things happening all over the place, but it's having a bit more strategic coordinated. So you've got the DFE breathing down schools next to great attainment, but then you've got, we know there's social emotional dysregulation, things like going on. So I think the more that we skill up and understand neurodiversity, understand trauma, understand these things, then that will shape the provision you put and the way you do things. And I think it would change that culture.
Yeah.
We're not there because we have demands to it, but I think it's really important. You are right that I know when we learned in our school about that neurodiversity, it really shaped what we did for those children. However, the impact was far more reaching than just those children. It was best for all children. And that's the thing that we sometimes forget is if we do something really good for a vulnerable group, we're actually doing it good for all. It becomes universal. Yeah. Sorry.
In a way, that was the point I was going to get to. So yes, you're absolutely correct. Yeah.
Thanks, Chair. That was really positive to hear because I was going to speak about attendance and the fact that so I'm involved in the home educating community, although I am no longer home educating, and I know that reports from parents are still very much the draconian stuff is making them take their children out of school. So I think work with parents on that attendance, particularly for this cohort of children, is really important. And I think certainly in my ward, there are a number of parents who are hitting that draconian response and just pulling their children out of school because they're going to be fined, which I think is a terrible approach personally, I'm just going to say. But there are those parents who are really struggling. And actually in my working life, working with families who've had a really poor experience of school, as soon as you've got the parents on board, you're most of the way there and you're nurturing them. And I think that approach sounds really positive that we're going to be working in that direction, because I think generally parents would like their children to be in school if they can be. So yeah, thank you.
The thing I have to do is realise my limitations of what I can do, because I can't order a school to do anything. All we can do is highlight things and give the right things to people to make the right inform, because they're intelligent people running schools. So, you know, it's that they come. So it needs a discussion, doesn't it? It needs to awareness raising and that. But I'm not going to be able to do it by myself. It's a system change, system thing that needs that.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Derek. That's a very comprehensive report. It's really useful. There's things to be pleased about, there's things to worry about, and that's what we're here for. I'd just like to comment and ask a question with regard to the attainment gap, because I think we agreed in our very first meeting that that was right at the top there of things that we were concerned about. So I see at item 7, we continue to champion children and to get that gap narrowed. With that in mind, and I realise this question may be more appropriate for Councillor Webb or Martin, we know that the schools can't do this alone. This is about supporting the parents. It's about other community and active groups that get involved to meet that gap. And the big one with reading is libraries. So my question is, what impact assessments have been undertaken prior to the decision with the proposed cuts in the forthcoming budget? Because £600,000 cuts to libraries, which is such a key part for children and young people and their parents in learning and access to reading, specifically the more disadvantaged in the city, because those of us who have an interest and have the wherewithal will take children to the central library, we'll take them to Waterstones and buy the books. So I'd just like to understand what the impact assessments have been done, and can we see the outcomes of those assessments, please?
In terms of the libraries, I think we probably require Pauline Stutfield to sort of be here to answer some of those questions. I think the majority of the question was a political question, which I'm not sure I can answer as an officer.
I can though. Thanks for jumping up there, Martin. But I think this is a bullet firmly pointed my direction, and I am impressed by the opposition for waiting this long to mention libraries. Actually, I thought that's quite good of you. But yeah, I think first and foremost, we're in a situation, of course, where the budget is incredibly tight. We are facing a shortfall of £14.3 million. That's what we've come into administration this time. to find. And I think it's really important on a few points. We're not going to be closing any libraries straight away. That's something that we have to say. Second to that, libraries in York have received, firstly, £5.5 million worth of capital investment since 2019 even. And that is unique in the country. Libraries have been protected for the last decade in York in a way that they've not been protected elsewhere. And actually, this is a question of fairness. We have to look at across all of the different things that the council provides and that our partners provide that we can look at. And it would be wrong if we made an exception for the library service. But as I've said, we are not closing any libraries, and we have also got to a position where we have some absolutely fantastic libraries. We shouldn't do them down. And they are going to provide excellent support for families out there, as they always have. So yeah, this is an ongoing conversation, but it would be wrong of us not to look at all aspects of the budget. There's an aspect of fairness in that, if nothing else. What I would say is that is slightly off the topic of this particular item. I hope I've been quite fair and I've given you a response to the question, but Chair, it's not necessarily linked to what we've got.
You can follow on, that's just don't expect an answer.
No. My question was, what impact assessment has been undertaken?
No,
we see it.
That is a fair point, and that is something that we will obviously come to at full council at the appropriate time. And I think the published documents, obviously in the exec, that come out Thursday as well. I don't have them to hand right now, but that is something that is ongoing, of course.
Can I just make, it's just a question of clarification quickly, if I may. It'll take 2 seconds. Just because I saw about 4 pencils go scribble, scribble, scribble. When you said we will not be closing any libraries straight away, I think what you meant was straight away. The first thing I will say is we will not be closing any libraries. Not we will be not closing any libraries at some point down the line.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I understand. I know that we're going to be the subject of a dozen leaflets in various wards as a result of this. It's that season, I understand. We've all been there. But it is something to point out. No, there's no plan to close any libraries.
Can I have my
Attainment.
Yes, I just feel like it's important to chip in when we are talking about attainment, about the fact that, yes, libraries play a really important role in schools. Mostly schools deliver their own reading, writing curriculum and work with libraries as an extra partner, which is obviously really important. But libraries are one part of a bigger ecosystem that also includes museums, cultural places, and actually there's a lot of evidence that cultural venues, access to culture, cultural capital as a whole is really important when it comes to the attainment of children, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I do find it interesting that while libraries have never had a single cut across the whole of austerity, which I'm sure they're really grateful for, that's not the case for the rest of the cultural ecosystem in the city. And actually, I think that schools have a real issue accessing culture in this city because of decisions that have been made around protecting other areas of the cultural ecosystem in the same way that, we've put into libraries, and yet they still have an offer for our schools. And I know that our libraries will continue to do everything they can to have an offer for our schools. They're also commercial venues, so they have a real opportunity to look at income generation as a way of continuing to be able to deliver the things that they deliver as an external provider, in the same way that York Museums Trust, for example, have that ask. But I think that it's important that we look at the wider ecosystem. Cultural capital is really, really important. And our children in the most disadvantaged areas of the city really miss out on that.
Chair, I think we're off-piste. I also have always thought that scrutiny was supposed to be non-political. And I do hope we can move on to the next agenda item.
Here, councillor Runciman, thank you.
Not to be political or anything, but just to say that the cultural capital and part of the curriculum and the design, and I know a lot of primary schools could go in them, are really thinking about the design of the curriculum meeting their needs of their young people, and cultural capital is that, and the living reading. It's a big thing. I go and do lots of deep dives. So schools are well cited on the importance of cultural capital and reading. Just say that. Thank you.
I'm going to ask a question in relation to breaking down the numbers, because each individual pupil will have their own situation as to why they're not achieving. And therefore, it's really to understand how the authority is looking at the mix. So just as with attendance, there are some people for whom there are very complex reasons and medical reasons why the child is not going to school as regularly. And there's the whole spectrum of why the pupil isn't turning up. And therefore, it's important not to say that they're all the same, because the approaches that the school takes is different. And that will apply to different aspects of why pupils are, that they have a gap between where you would hope they would be based on national figures and where they are. So it's really saying, you said that in individual schools there may be small numbers, but because you're looking across the whole city, there's an opportunity to say this is a method that a school has applied for a sub cohort and it's successful, versus another school that hasn't quite made that connection.
So a couple of things around that. One is we do analyse data and see what the barriers are, and hence why when we looked at that really closely in early is why early talk for York came out of that, because it was speech and language predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly. When you got small resource, that was a good area to start. So that's one thing. The other thing we look at in the data is where pockets are in York. So we're targeting certain, particular schools. So obviously you won't be surprised, Westfield, Clifton Green area, Yearsley Grove area, Fishergate has some different, but still areas there. So I'm responsible in the great part for maintaining schools. But on the YSAF board, we sit and we talk about all schools in York as well. So Matt will be looking at, so it's very much about targeting resource as well as a particular general area that, when you look at the data, it's pointing to that area as being an area that we need to invest in and support the sector with. And then there's that, which areas of schools, areas of York need the most support and working together. And you've probably heard of things like family hubs and things set up that helps to bring agencies together. We're doing very well working with Healthy Child Service, and as you can tell, the Speech and Language Service. So that's been great growth, and we should grow more. The other thing is, looking outside, we work with a charity called Nesta. It's down there what the acronym's for. And it's really challenges around 2-year-olds as well. And so quite a lot of edges going on there and working, and that's some things to come through yet. And I think that will be Barbara as well, talking a little bit around that area. But yeah, so yeah, breaking down numbers, but it sets out then target support, but also the universal support that we give.
Thanks. Just to finish this item, and thank you, Derek. You've had a good grilling tonight, slightly more than I imagine you thought you would. Thank you for the work that you're putting in on this. And the thing that, this report obviously comes to this scrutiny committee on a sort of annual basis at least, and we talk about the attainment gap a lot. And of course, we like to talk about trends, and I totally see the point of doing that. And but I think we must always remember that children only get this chance once. So that's why I'm really glad to be focusing, and I'll unashamedly focus on our most vulnerable First, because if we can get it right for those young people who are disadvantaged by society in all sorts of different ways, then it makes such a difference for that individual child's life. And we mustn't lose sight of that. But in the data and the stats and everything we do, that they only get one go at it, right? We'll look at year 6 and year 11 every year that we do this, but that year 6 becomes year 7, becomes year 8, becomes year 9, year 11s, 12s, 13, 14 and gone, right? That's something we need to just keep in our heads when we're doing this. But yeah, thanks very much, Derek, for the work you put in and for your team as well, because it's not an easy task.
Without prolonging it too long, there is some stuff in the report, and Derek mentioned it very briefly around the work that we're going to start with the ADHD Foundation. What I would say is that if you Google, I think, I'm not sure whether you'll be able to find it, but the Neurodiversity Network through the ADHD Foundation, there's some really interesting stuff. A lot of this is about influencing people thinking and function the way they think. Trying to develop a much more strengths-based approach to neurodiversity. So, the work that the ADHD Foundation brings out all the qualities that we really celebrate in adulthood. There are many people sat around this table, I am sure, that will be neurodiverse. Many of us, most of us aren't. It's about how we can find ways of celebrating that, bringing out the real skills of those young people in a system. Some of that work that we will do in developing a much more neurodiverse community is to try and celebrate and help train the system to understand that there's some real benefits in thinking differently for these young people.
It's maybe a short one, very, very short, just on that point. And I know I've had a really good go this evening, and I promise the next item I'll only ask something that just to highlight to you, because you just made me sort of think that there is an absolutely incredible website called Spectrum Gaming. It's run by young people who have all different types of neurodiversity, and it is all about what would they like from the organizations, the things that they interact with. So it's about what would school look like that would work for me, what would go into the doctors or the health service or whatever. So if there's one thing you can take away when you're thinking about the ADHD and autism, Spectrum Gaming as a website is absolutely fantastic.
I'll have to allow Councillor Nelson.
Thank you. I promise this is the last one. But it did just remind me that I did have one more question that I'd noted down about the discussions that we'd had about trauma-informed practice. And it's really, really great to see everyone talking about how important it is to try and get that into schools. Obviously, we have an advisory role, but we do have a support and training role as well. I'm aware that in other local authorities, the virtual school has funded specialist trauma-informed practice, SENCO and teacher courses. I personally did one through an organisation called Touchbase. I know there are other organisations out there. And I just wondered if it's not already happening, and I know, Martin, I've emailed you about this before, there's a takeaway that could be looked into about how the local authority could have a role offering, maybe one teacher a year from the schools in your, or some sort of model around that, offering that trauma-informed practice training, or working with partners like the virtual school to do that for us, our teachers.
Sorry, it was funny because I had a discussion yesterday with the head of virtual school. We were talking about the resource she has. She has a person that goes in schools. It would be better if we could get in front of that and actually help schools understand. I've done it once, doing a thing on trauma. The other thing is we've got an EP service that has put that information out, but it's gone out in like electronic form. But behind that, some things that people go on webs. But it is something we're revisiting, because we did do a lot on it once, but we need to revisit that.
I think what's worked really well in some places is having, this is an annual offer and you send one teacher a year, but every year you send a different teacher or something like that. I think it's important for it to be a consistent.
Yeah. One of the issues we do have, and I've said this to, the guys, TFE, is that the teaching school is doing some great work around SEND champions, adaptive teaching. but they can only do DFE prescribed programmes. And actually, sometimes we need to be searching further afield from just DFE. So that's something that we try to do. And as you can see in York, we've tried some approaches that are DFE informed. But we will look more at that. And I think it's something, there's still a lot of work to do on coordinating that and bringing it around together. It's something as well on the way down.
Very quickly, I think what we've talked about is there's a need for a rounded balance of training, support, and to how we think differently about children. I think, I know some authorities have absolutely invested huge amounts in trauma-informed practice. The risk is that takes everybody to the sense of it must be about trauma. What I'm seeing in terms of behaviour, it must be trauma, which it must be something about the parenting. And we need to be really careful with that, and let's just have a really sensible balance to say, actually, this may well be neurodiversity, it may be speech and language, it may be about trauma. And we can't focus just on one. We've absolutely got to make sure that we deliver all of those issues.
I think the label can definitely be unhelpful. I think the strategies that sit under all of that are universal.
Right, Derek. We'll call it a night for you, mate. Unless you want to stay and support Barbara. Are you going to leave Barbara? Now, the mistake you made, you said, you want to write more next time. And picking up what Councillor Runciman said, 27 to 31, where you've got the outcome, when would be a reasonable point for you to come back and say, I've got
so this
some...
time next year, I'll have data again and that's come in. But it's whether it's do it all in one go or some kids to do so much in one go, some sales and send or something. I don't know. I'll leave that to you.
What do we think? Chunk it up one.
Summer before the results, because we're doing results in the autumn.
Summer? Is that okay?
So summer, yes, you will get it, but it's not validated. It's validated in the autumn.
As long as we know what we're getting in terms of, you know, this is draft one or...
Yeah, it'll be, we don't need to do the data.
Yeah. But I think as Councilman picked up, you know, you've got 5, you know, outcomes you're working towards, and I think it'd be handy to, rather than wait the whole year.
Yeah.
We'll get another date and come back. If you're good, we get you back. Thank you very much. Right. Yeah, go on. Barbara, you're up next. Early years in childcare.
Thank you. Derek's actually stated there's a very strong link with the outcomes for the young children, just in case there's any questions. But this paper is to inform scrutiny about the new reforms that are coming in for early years in childcare. They're coming online from April this year, so they're imminent and to be in place by September 26. And also to outline the benefits and the challenges, and there are quite a few risks to implementation as well that are significant. So what happened is back in March last year, the Chancellor announced a number of measures to help the parents back into work, whilst giving children more access to early education. And it's taken quite some time for the civil servants to work out the detail of that announcement for it to come through to local authorities. And as well, what they've done is announced an investment in the funding rates and to invest in the expansion of wraparound care as well. So the reforms, they are significant in terms of the changes because they are changes in eligibility for children. And probably one of the biggest changes that we've seen in early years in childcare for many, many years. And for the very first time, working parents of children from 9 months old will be eligible 15 hours each week from April of this year, and next year, 30 hours in September. And the expansion of wraparound care is going to be just as significant to meet the existing demand and also the new demand that will be coming through from parents. So the government, they know that local authorities are critical to facilitating the growth in the market to meet that new demand. And because of this, they've provided some capacity funding for local authorities, and it includes a capital allocation as well, so we can expand and reconfigure space in the city where we can. And such is the scale of the challenge of the work, there'll also be a strategic support contractor And there'll be an announcement in the next few weeks, and that contractor will work with local authorities and we will work closely with them as well. And what I would say is that York is in a very good starting position for the reforms, and I've set those positives out in paragraph 9 of the paper. But it's the operating environment which is really complex and challenging, because we've had historical underfunding for many, many years, recruitment and retention issues, low morale of the sector and feeling devalued for a very long period of time. We have a lack of suitable premises in the city, and we also have a gap, a small gap in after-school provision for children with complex needs, places for children with SEND, and we've had a recent loss of a day nursery in the Clifton Green site. So moving forward, we're firstly required to carry out a really deep dive into sufficiency of the childcare market and do a really detailed analysis. And I know that every year we do a sufficiency analysis, but that's really high level, but we've got to get down to the real detail about where the gaps are, what types of gaps there are, and the level of places that are needed. And all of that information will inform a development plan, and we will set down priorities for where we're going to facilitate the market. But we know for sure that we do need baby places in the Clifton Green area. We need after-school provision for children with complex needs, SEND places, but also making sure that those disadvantaged twos of non-working parents aren't displaced by the new reforms, because the new reforms are very focused on working parents, you know, and for them to be able to work. So in facilitating the market, we want all new provision to be financially viable. That's really important for the longer term. And we want that to happen over a reasonable period of time. And we want the best quality for children and for them to be as inclusive as possible. And that said, even though you do that assessment of the market, there are still a number of factors that impact on sufficiency. And that's the Ofsted judgments, all impacted by the pressure on the sector, recruitment, retention, that low funding. And we can't have our eligible twos in provision that's not the best quality either. We also need the right business models across the city, and to get the comms really clear and timely, because this is all complex for parents and providers. Other key challenges which add further risk are about moving to a monthly payment system rather than termly, which we do at the moment, and ensuring our IT system, which is Synergy, has the right functionality, and being mindful of the quite long timescales for providers to whether this new provision to register with Ofsted and to register with HMRC to be able to offer tax-free childcare to parents, and both of them are taking between 3 and 6 months nationally, and we constantly escalate those sorts of issues to the DfE, who are aware of it, and having those discussions at a high level. The key risk is that we fail to expand the market in the right way to meet demand in line with the national timescales, and our new statutory duties wouldn't be delivered, which would open us up to legal and reputational challenge, and children would also be at risk of the poor outcomes. And parents wouldn't be able to go to work, and that would be a risk to the economy for York, which we want to grow the economy. In mitigation, I would go back to paragraph 9, that we do have a really good starting point in York, very experienced staff, and we have good relationships with the PVI sector. The DfE, they monitor our readiness, we complete termly self-assessments for them, and we regularly escalate those issues that require a national solution in some cases. So the report asks Scrutiny to note the contents of the report and to comment on the contents, and I've set out in Annex A more detail about the timescales as well. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Barbara. Very good.
Questions, Councillor Runciman, up and running.
Barbara and I have got a history going back a long way, haven't we, Barbara? It's the sustainability and the business support that I worry about, Barbara. It's all very well starting a preschool group with a whole lot of people that are trained to care for children, but they're not necessarily trained to run a business. I think that the early years team I've got a job on their hands now, but I'd like to know if that business support will be able to be available to them, so that they can perhaps work with the IT system if it's doing what it should, and make sure that the whole thing doesn't collapse without the right business advice.
Yes, really important, because the business models will have to look different, because they're not able to charge for the fees outside of the early education entitlements in the way that they have done. So they are going to have to look at what their break-even points are across the whole of the business, instead of looking at individual year groups as they have been doing. And what we will be doing is signposting to organisations that can offer some of that business support. We've had recent conversations with the economic team, the council, and there are some organisations that we can signpost to, and we'll give that individual support. And the strategic partner that will be appointed by the DfE will be looking at business models and how they share that good practice with individual providers, and there will probably be training events for providers as well. One group that we are concerned about are the play groups, because we want to encourage them to change the business model and take the younger children, because there is a danger now, because you've got the new entitlements for younger children, that parents will vote with their feet and will go to the day nurseries where they can access those places much earlier on, and not use the play group. So the groups are recognising that they may have to shift the model as well, and we'll be encouraging that as we go through the reforms.
We're going to Councillor Nelson, Councillor Wallace-Martin. Do you want to say anything on this report contingent to 5 minutes left?
No, I'll probably say on 10 to 15 years, that's fine.
Right. Councillor Nelson, Councillor.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for this report. My questions, I've got two, which are about the local authorities funding formula and kind of the funding that we will be providing to nurseries. I've heard a lot about this on the radio and kind of in the news this week, particularly about how providers are still waiting for confirmation on what they will be paid per child from the government. And, you know, that obviously is a massive uncertainty when the 2-year-old funding is supposed to kick in April. And I believe that's it's up to us to kind of decide that and communicate that. My second question, kind of alongside that really, is, you know, I'm hearing a lot about providers in other places closing down preemptively, you know, closing the nurseries because they're no longer allowed to charge top-up fees. The amount of money per child that they've been funded has always been inadequate, and they've only been able to keep their business going by charging top-up fees. Are we aware of any of our providers, current providers, who are considering closing or scaling down their business because of the challenges that of not being able to provide top-ups, charge top-ups, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, the providers across the country, they've been really frustrated by not having the information as early as possible, because we do engage with our PPI sector on a regular basis, have the ongoing dialogue, even if it's just to say we don't know anything at the moment. But what we have shared with our providers in York is that we've shared the indicative rates for each of the year groups. So they've got a fairly good idea about what the rates would look like, and they've been consulted as part of that. And there is a report to go to School Forum, I think on the 1st of February, to look at the rates in more detail, but they're broadly in line with the indicative amounts. And yes, there was a big piece in the press last night about that, because I believe that some authorities haven't even shared the indicative rates, but we have. And what we have done on a fairly regular basis is survey the providers about, you know, where they think they are currently in terms of their viability. And I would say that it's a relatively positive position. You know, it all depended on what the funding looked like and how it translates at the front line in terms of that hourly rate. But certainly the more we're not aware from the intelligence gathering that we do, that there's any imminent, you know, threat of imminent closure. But we would certainly work with those ones that are upfront with us and do share that with us. But there is some optimism out there, but they do recognise it's incredibly hard for them to move forward.
So can I ask, does that include childminders as well?
It does.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
And we are, sorry, just to add for childminders, we are looking at a monthly payment system as well, because currently we pay all providers on a termly basis, but we recognise for childminders that that's not as straightforward for them in terms of, you know, the way that they manage their business arrangements. But we can only operate one system because of the administration. So we have consulted and we're just working through the technical details of that, and it should be doable. And we want to test the new system for childminders and providers during the summer with a view to implementing the monthly payment system from September.
So would that move all providers onto the monthly payment
providers.
system?
Yeah, so that should
That's
help
much
cash
better.
flows as well.
Thank you. Well, I think my question really follows on from what Barbara said, because the impact of COVID meant that a lot of the businesses started to eat through their reserves, and therefore the long-term viability there was a wobble across the city, and a number of them closed. So I think it's just to understand, now that you've shared the indicative amounts, they will be able to work that through their business plans, and it's understanding, particularly for the maintained sector, the impact it'll have on them in terms of, will it help them, or will the problems within the system on funding just be reinforced? So year on year, it's always been a difficulty, but it's going to put some different pressures on business plans going forward, and you've got the recruitment and retention and training problems built in. So it's understanding where we will be the next time that you come in a year's time to talk about this sector.
Definitely, because I still think it's too early to tell what the impact is on the business models, and because of that operating environment that we're in, and just the pure cost of living as well. But there's still, I mean, it sounds great, you know, the amount that's been invested nationally when you look at the figures, but when you translate it through to the hourly rates, it's really poor. And they were historically underfunded. And then when we got to COVID, they had their funding was so poor compared to schools as well. So that had to push them back even further.
I'm sorry. I seem to remember there was an issue about finding new premises for new providers. And I'm just wondering if we've got any thoughts about that. I mean, it's a knotty problem, I'm aware, but it just strikes me that some kind of commercial innovation might be useful here. We can work round to that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an ongoing challenge because we need spaces that are appropriate, and ideally have got access to outside areas for children as well. We constantly meet with our colleagues in property services to review what the council has across the city that might be coming up, and with other partners, and even links into the private sector as well. And we may have to be even more creative going forward. And I don't know what the solutions are. And it might be, I don't know, about incentivising providers to transport children, you know, with costs built in, which makes it really unaffordable for parents. But we've really got to think outside the box, I think, going forward.
Thank you, Emily.
Councillor Crawshaw. You're joking. So I think it's very much a lot, like you said, it's a lot of wait and see on this one, isn't it? It's sort of, you're ready, but let's wait and see. I presume you're happy coming back next year, give it a chance to bed in.
Yeah, happy to come back when you want us to. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, appreciate that. Work plan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Down to the pub, we'll see you then. There is some work, that's the work plan then. Hang on. I've got it. I'm not, I think, just finding it. It's got a perfect tag now. So we have, where are we at? January. So March and April planned out. Are we still not in a position to add in anything beyond that? Are we? Apart from adding in the summer.
Suggest one will be July, the date's not been confirmed yet.
We don't meet in May or June.
I can come back with this.
When do we meet?
Talk about next meetings, then I can come back at next one. I'll see where I can confirm dates. I think I'll ask them.
Right. So we don't meet in May, do we? Do we not meet in May? Is it our choice?
Reece, are we at one of the committees that is paused because of the mayoral elections and the pre-election period or not? I'm aware that some are having to stop and some aren't.
Councillor Webb shaking his head in acknowledgement.
I'll see what I can confirm on next meeting dates.
When?
22nd of April. This is what's currently in the diary anyway.
You've got 9th of April.
Oh, right.
When are we looking to
Oh,
meet?
I've got the 9th and the 22nd.
We meet on the 9th of April. Obviously, the election, we get a mayor in May. Do you want to meet after that, or is that too close to that?
Got no dates after April at the moment.
No.
It wouldn't normally be our decision as a scrutiny committee.
Is it not?
The corporate calendar will get laid out and it'll be set in stone, so, yeah.
So it's our committee and we don't get to choose when we meet?
Yeah. I'll see if I
It's
can
all about how
come
many
back
rooms we've got available.
We said today though, didn't we, that we'd like to see attainment back in the summer
Yes.
after the data come in, even though it would be indicative, so.
Chair, can we just have the dates circulated when they're set? As Johnny rightly says, they will be set and they'll make sure they don't clash and rooms are available and, you know, all that sort of stuff.
So-
We can just have them round now. I realise I may not be subbing at that time, but I should be very interested.
As somebody who's not been done a full year yet, when is this meeting that sets the dates held?
We set the dates.
No, the one that.
So what would normally happen is around about now, the Democratic Services will be looking at the corporate calendar for the next municipal year. It usually ends up getting published, I think it's about March, April time, something like that.
Right.
And then you get everything for the next calendar year.
So in March and April, we can plan when we're going to meet. Well, they'll tell us, as you say, availability of
to the items to consider.
but we will
Okay.
include that item.
Summer, you know.
You just put summer for
Like in-
that coming back on the attainment.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then when we've got a date, she can discuss when they can come in.
Right.
And then I assume we would sit down with
And
the
we'll plan it.
officers, do one of these, bring it back to the committee and see what people
If we're all
feed
happy.
into it, if people
Cool.
are happy, if people think it's lots.
Good, right, one thing, a couple of weeks ago, myself, Councillor Nelson, and met Councillor Webb, and we had a good idea, we thought, hopefully you'll agree, to bring youth council along to these meetings. You know, we've heard tonight, you know, the impact, I think you said last night it was there. So I don't think it'd be a bad thing to invite them, especially since we're probably coming up to, you know, the culture bit, which kids, without pigeonholing them, probably prefer culture to education.
I'm not sure. I think they'd love to moan about education just as much as the rest of us, quite frankly.
So if we're happy with that, we shall, I did make some general inquiries. We don't think there's any objections to them coming along, so.
We initially said youth council members. I mean, I don't know how you want to progress this, whether you're a pre-meet or people come along, or that's entirely up to you, but I do think it's worth having representative on this committee potentially from the youth council. I think it'd be a good step
I
forward.
think what we've discussed as a kind of possible starting point is having an open seat for a representative of the youth council to participate in the meetings. it then is up to them whether there's a young person who wants to come. It may be that they don't want to come or they don't come to all of them, but what we were discussing is there is a chair for a member of the youth council, and when they have a look at what's on the agenda, they might decide to come along or not.
I'm sorry to protract this discussion,
That's
but
fine.
when we've done it before, there are some items on the agenda they don't want to join in.
Yeah.
And there are some that they do want to join in, and I'm sure Bob can have a conversation with them and find out which is which.
That's precisely how we've wanted to do it. You know, if they don't want to participate in an item and they just want to come along for a bit of a meeting even, they're welcome to. If they want to do more or less, that's absolutely fine.
Cool. Good, I'll agree on that. Task and finish. We've got a gap until March. I was thinking we'd get an update in March, if that's.
It's on my list to email you to say we need to have a catch up.
Yeah,
And we're
what's-
having a meeting with Pauline Stutchfield week after next. February half term, I think it is.
Yeah, and so because we've got February, no meeting, it's a bit of a chance to catch up again.
March, I think March we could have something.
Cool. Did you want to bring anything up?
There's
Leave it after.
something for after.
Right, okay, that's fine. Lovely. I lost the agenda now. Any urgent business? No, we haven't. Oh.
Councillor Webber's, I nearly said closed.
It's not urgent business, but it's something we did discuss regarding the free school meals policy. And obviously this is something that is emerging, and as I've said previously, we're working with the University of York and an academic from the University of Sheffield to actually do an evaluation of this pilot year that we're running through at the moment. And so we're in the early stages, obviously, of that now. It started in Westfield, it's starting in Burton Green week yesterday, I believe. And the academics, I'm meeting with them on the 1st of February just to confirm exactly how they want to do their evaluation and what it is that they want to do. But the initial thoughts are that they could have something put together for us, hopefully by September, to obviously inform sort of the thoughts and decisions that I want to make and that this council wants to make going forward about what we can do and what we could do. And I thought that actually, to be completely open, honest and transparent, I think bringing whatever those academics produce, whatever that evaluation looks like, to a meeting here, preferably between September and Christmas, for example, to look at next steps. And to outline a few bits and pieces about what we want to do and what works. So if the committee is happy with that, I'd like to think about doing that.
We are, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yes.
The royal we, I like that there, Councillor Nichols.
So when we get this thing from whoever else, we'll start filling our gaps for that. Brilliant. Sorry, I forgot about that, Bob. Cool, right. We shall close at 7:27, shall we call it?
7:25.